I don't think I've ever seen a video game elicit such an emotional response from people than Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Talking about this game with someone is like a coin flip. A 50-50 shot between hearing that it's either the greatest game of all time and that it's a life-changing experience, or they'll fly into an uncontrollable rage and claim it's one of the worst JRPGs ever made. The best part about all of this is that I don't think I've heard anyone from either side properly communicate why they feel the way they do. There's just something about this game that awakens a person's most primal instincts when discussing it. They enter a fight or flight state where it goes from talking about a video game to a literal life or death scenario, and most normal people had no idea what the hell they were even talking about.
Xenoblade Chronicles 2?
While a lot of these debates have died down over the years, it's still a topic that comes up from time to time. Whenever I see a game or a movie have this much of a mixed reaction from audiences, I oddly end up feeling more compelled to check it out than I otherwise would have. After hearing such a wide spectrum of opinions, I wanted to get into the action myself and see what all the hubbub was about. In my original Xenoblade video, I mentioned how I was aware of the series all the way back in 2014, but I never played any of the games. That was only half true. I actually bought Xenoblade 2 all the way back in 2018 alongside a Pro controller. I thought, hey, may as well try out a more hardcore Switch game, right? So I booted up the game and played it for all about 2 hours before putting it down. I don't quite remember why I did, but I do remember feeling a little mixed on what I played. I thought the game looked great, but the combat felt very stiff and slow. I was really struggling to enjoy myself, so I ended up shelving the game after the prologue chapter. Maybe it was just my headspace at the time, but the lack of an immediate hook was certainly a hurdle. Even back then I realized I was being a bit unfair towards Xenoblade 2, so instead of taking to the heavens and fully denouncing the game, I instead wanted to wait a bit longer before giving it another shot. But uh-oh, that was over 6 years ago. It wasn't until I finally sat down and played the original Xenoblade Chronicles when this game once again entered my radar. But again, its mixed reception crept into my mind. I wasn't going to let that deter me, however. I loved the original game, so I was more than willing to give Xenoblade 2 a fair shake. And after sitting down and investing almost 100 hours of my life into this game, I can certainly say I have a lot to say about this one. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is a game that's unapologetically itself. It knows what it wants to be and has a specific target audience in mind, and there's a pretty high chance that you're not a part of it. What this results in is a game that's a bit of an acquired taste. Some people are gonna love it, and others are gonna absolutely hate it. For me, there was a lot of stuff in this game that I really enjoyed, but at the same time, there were just as many things that I couldn't stand for the life of me. Despite all of that though, I came out of the experience feeling a lot more positive than negative. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is a game that's a bit hard to love. However, it's even harder to hate. So let's talk about it. By the way, I should mention that this video is going to be filled with spoilers for the first two Xenoblade games. While it might not look like it initially, these two games are deeply connected to each other in rather clever ways, so I don't want to rob anyone of their first time experiencing this stuff. It's always best to go into RPGs as blind as possible because it allows for the time investment to have a much greater payoff if you do. I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page here before we got started. In the world of Alrest, there exists nothing but the Cloud Sea, a seemingly endless ocean populated by monolithic beasts known as Titans. Much like the Bionis and the Mechanis from the original game, Titans are the host of all life in Alrest. Think of every Titan as a different continent of the world, since every one of them is home to a wide variety of people, culture, wildlife, and all that stuff. Though, unlike the Bionis and Mechanis, Titans have a certain life expectancy. Whether that be due to old age or having all of their resources drained, a Titan will eventually die, and when that happens, they'll plummet deep into the Cloud Sea, taking every living being with it. This naturally causes some political unease within Alrest. As the population grows and the livable land dwindles, there's a looming threat of an all-out war between the nations. Some of them have already begun to forcibly claim land from others with the help of these mystical weapons known as blades. Blades aren't quite like your normal weapons, as they're actually living and breathing creatures linked to the weapon itself. Not everyone can wield a blade, however, as those only with a strong will are able to resonate with the material necessary to manifest the blade. These special people are commonly known as drivers, and most of them are immediately enlisted into the army so that they can be put to use by the government. But that's not quite important right now. What matters most is the introduction to our protagonist. This is Rex, a 15-year-old boy that works as a salvager and lives on the back of his adoptive grandfather at Zerta. Rex is basically a blue-collar worker. He dives deep into the Cloud Sea to recover any useful artifacts or trinkets and sells them to make ends meet. It's not much, but it's honest work. That is until he gets himself involved with some shady individuals, and I mean just look at them. Jin isn't exactly the most huggable guy out there, and Malice immediately attacks Rex as a test of strength. Not exactly the best crowd to be around, but the pay is far too good to pass up. What should have been a quick and dirty salvaging job is completely turned on its head because, as it turns out, Rex's temporary companions are actually the terrorist group known as Torna, and they aren't just looking for some measly treasure to sell. Their goal is to retrieve the Aegis, a legendary blade so powerful that it's said to have the potential to completely destroy Titans, and you better believe that Torna plans on using it for their own gain. But before leaving, Jin makes short work of Rex and prepares to take care of any and all witnesses. With Rex on death's door, he finds himself in a mysterious field and comes in contact with the Aegis, who introduces herself as Pyra. Pyra is quick to cut a deal with Rex. She offers to lend the young man half of her life force to revive him, but in exchange, Pyra wants Rex to escort her to Elysium, a mythical land said to be located at the top of the World Tree at the center of the Cloud Sea. With no other options, Rex agrees to Pyra's terms, and is revived thanks to the power of the Aegis. With Pyra acting as his blade, Rex attempts to take down Jin and Malos here and now, but even with the assistance of the now defected Nia, Torna proves themselves to be too much to handle. While the group attempts to escape on the back of Azurta, he's eventually shot down by cannon fire from a nearby ship, sending them all plummeting down to the Cloud Sea below. When Rex comes to, he and Pyra find themselves on a completely different continent, with Azurta now reverted to a more primitive state. It doesn't take too long for the duo to reunite with Nia and her blade Dramark, but they're unable to rest easy, since upon making it to the town of Toragath, Nia is arrested by members of the Empire due to her association with Torna. Rex and Pyra are able to escape and run into Tora, a Napon engineer. It's thanks to him and the artificial blade Poppy that the group is able to stage a break-in and rescue Nia before her execution. And while she's grateful for Rex's heroism, Nia attempts to ditch the young boy, but Rex is able to persuade her to stay by revealing his intentions. Rex wants to reach Elysium, not just because of the promise he made to Pyra, but because he hopes to find a solution to the Titan crisis. With that, Rex and his comrades set out on a journey to the World Tree, one that's filled with many trials, tribulations, and an underlying truth that is yet to be revealed to the world of Alrest. What I just described was the first 2 chapters of Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and it's a lot to take in at once. Some might even argue that there's a bit too much dumped on the player. Let's play a fun game of compare and contrast. The opening hours of the original Xenoblade Chronicles did a great job at setting up the story and world in a way that allowed new players to follow along. A lot of fiction is meant to reflect our real world. This is something that both Xenoblade games love to do, but the difference between them is that the first game kept a lot of the more out-there concepts to a minimum. When you really break it down, the original game has a pretty simple premise. It's a revenge story set in the backdrop of an ongoing war between 2 different nations. Most of the sci-fi elements are set dressing. Of course, races like the Mechon and the 2 Titans the story takes place on are important to the overall narrative, but the limited worldview we have at the start of the game benefits the opening hours. All you need to know is that the Mechon are bad and our hero has a magic sword that lets him see the future. It's simple enough for people to immediately latch onto, only for their initial views to eventually get flipped on their head. Xenoblade 2's opening really focuses on the mystical sci-fi junk instead of the more tangible and relatable ideas. Don't get me wrong, they do exist in this world. Stuff like overpopulation and lack of living space are very real issues that we're dealing with in our real world, but at the start of the game, it mostly serves as a backdrop for the story. The opening mainly focuses on some of the more mechanical shit like blades and drivers. We're introduced to a wide variety of characters of different races, alignment, and motivation. What exactly is the Aegis? Who are Torna and what are their goals? Why are the Titans dying out? Why does this little furball want to fuck a maid so bad? It's all stuff that's meant to get you intrigued, and I can imagine it being effective to a certain audience. Alrest is a massive world, and you're just sort of thrown into the thick of it and are meant to piece everything together through story dialogue, character interactions, and visual cues. This is all extremely important stuff to the world and narrative of Xenoblade 2. But it's extremely overwhelming, and I'm sure as hell not the only one who felt this way. A lot of people struggled to really get into Xenoblade 2 back when it first came out. While a lot of that has to do with the way the game drip feeds its core mechanics, which I'll get into later, I wouldn't be surprised if the narrative also played a large part in that. Things do happen during the first few chapters, but the overall story feels rather directionless until the end of Chapter 2, where the main goals are fully established. And depending on how you play these games, that sense of directionless can last a very long time. It took me about 6 hours to reach the end of Chapter 2, mostly because I was committed to sampling all of the game's content on offer. But during that time, I was left wondering when the story was gonna pick up, which isn't something that I felt while playing the first game. Colony 9 was a clear prologue area. The story was still finding its footing during that time, introducing you to the key players in the narrative and helping you get accustomed to the core mechanics. It's when you leave Colony 9 after the invasion in Chapter 2 when the story establishes its main hook. It takes Xenoblade 2 a bit longer to find its groove, and even then, it's a rather slow-paced journey. I can see why some people really just couldn't get into the game because of how slow it feels. I don't think the opening hours of Xenoblade 2 are bad or anything, but it doesn't feel as tightly executed compared to the originals. I don't want to make this too much of a pissing match between these two games. I mostly just wanted to highlight my preference in storytelling. It's hard not to talk about Xenoblade 2 without mentioning its drastic change in presentation. It might come as a bit of a surprise to some people, but there was a point in time when the Xenoblade Chronicles art style was more interested in pushing realism. Stylized for sure, but the game's color palette and environmental design was meant to strike a balance between the grounded and fantastical. The first Xenoblade game on Wii looks closer to something like Final Fantasy XII rather than what the franchise would end up adopting. Impressive for the time, but even back then, you could tell that the hardware wasn't up to snuff to fully realize the developer's visions. Xenoblade 2 takes a drastically different approach to the game's art direction, adopting a more traditional anime aesthetic. There are plenty of bright colors, large and expressive eyes, and more exaggerated character movements. There was a lot of buzz about the art style shift when the game was first released. There were a lot of people who adored the new direction, and just as many who were disappointed to see the series drop the more realistic aesthetic that Xenoblade 1 and X had. I can't comment on this discussion too much since the only version of Xenoblade 1 that I finished was the Switch release, which had its art style updated to be more in line with 2. If I can say anything about it, I think the approach taken in Xenoblade 2 onwards is very pleasing. Though, I won't lie, I did get a little curious as to why the art direction took such a massive shift. I did some digging and found some really interesting interviews with Tetsuya Takahashi. In case you don't know, he's the founder of Monolith Soft and is the main mind behind the entire Xeno franchise, going all the way back to 1998's Xenogears. I find Takahashi to be a very fascinating artist, and reading through interviews with him paints a very good picture of his creative process. In an interview with Denfami Nikogamer, he talks about his tendencies of getting bored with certain concepts. According to the man himself, once he's done with a project, he wants nothing to do with it anymore, which is why he's so willing to experiment. The change in art style was partially motivated by the Switch's player base, but in his own words, he wanted to do the exact opposite of the original Xenoblade Chronicles as an experiment. I find Takahashi's pursuit for creative fulfillment to be very admirable. He's willing to flip what we expect on our heads for the sake of chasing ideas that come to him. It gives all of his games such a unique quality because of it. For better or for worse is certainly up for debate, but what I get out of reading interviews of his creative process is that he's extremely passionate about artistic expression, which is cool to see. There's a lot of interesting facts about Xenoblade 2 that can be gathered from these interviews, but I'll have to save some of the more juicy stuff for when it becomes more relevant. Basically, this new art direction wasn't chosen to be more appealing to newcomers if you're a part of the camp that thinks this. Though, if the presentation of Xenoblade 2 is brought up, the first thing that'll come to mind is most likely the voice acting. Probably one of the most infamous aspects of the game, Xenoblade 2's English voice acting is often regarded as not very good, and yeah, I can see where they're coming from. Don't get me wrong, the voice talent behind the characters is pretty strong. There's not a single character in this game whose voice that I would describe to be as unfitting. And keeping with the theme of the first game, all of the characters have distinct accents. Though this time, there's a much wider variety. Rex speaks in a Northern England accent. Nia has that familiar Welsh dialect of emphasizing certain vowels. The temporary party member Van Damme speaks with the cadence of an Australian. What's really interesting is that the accents aren't tied to specific characters. Rather, it's reflective of where they're from. One of the party members, Morag, has a Scottish accent, though later on when we visit the more Ardane Empire, we learn that all Ardanians speak that way. I always liked how the original Xenoblade Chronicles handled its dub. The British accents gave the game a unique flavor compared to most JRPGs on the market. And it's cool to see that Xenoblade 2 not only kept that idea, but expanded on it and turned it into a cool piece of world building. Just like real life, how your speech is developed depends on the people around you. Of course, in a game about venturing around the world, the party members will all have different dialects from each other. Some characters even incorporate British slang into their speak.
Titan's fucked. If I wasn't dead, I'd kick that guy's ass.
You think after this Rex went to go have a Sunday dinner with his family? Ate some beans on toast? Fucking bubonic plague. I feel like a lot of people judge voice acting a bit unfairly in video games. Of course you're allowed to like and dislike whatever you want, but sometimes people take it a step further and blame the actors themselves for their performances, which I find to be a little ignorant. Very rarely will you find voice acting that's bad because the actor lacks the ability to convey the proper emotions needed to sell the character. I mean, they had to beat out potentially hundreds of people to get the role to begin with, so it's obvious that the studio believed in their performance enough to feature them in the game. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is a special case, because the voice acting complaints are usually levied against the entire cast, instead of singling out individual performances. In a scenario where seemingly every character aside from a select few isn't doing the best job in the world, then it's safe to say that the voice direction is to blame. From everything I've gathered from doing research, this game was extremely rushed and understaffed. More than half of the studio was working on Breath of the Wild at the time of this game's development. Accounting for the research and development team leaves us with about 40 internal staff members left to work on Xenoblade 2. That's not a whole lot of people, especially when the game's scope is as large as this one's. Xenoblade 2 is very rough around the edges, something that still is noticeable even after years of patches and updates. God forbid if you played this game at launch, because from everything I've gathered, it was not a pretty sight. And as a result, the English dub suffered a bit. Believe it or not, JRPGs are made with a Japanese audience in mind. This means that the Japanese dub of the game has more priority than the English one does. The time it takes to localize a game of this scale is monumental, and on top of that, you need to hire and schedule multiple talents. And for a game that features hours upon hours of voice dialogue, it's a long and expensive process, one that Monolith Soft really didn't have time to focus on all too much. Rumor has it that the voice actors weren't given much context or direction for their performances, and they weren't allowed to do more than a few takes on any given line due to time constraints. Nintendo just had to hit that holiday 2017 release date after all. That Christmas money was just too good to pass up. Though to be honest, I had a hard time verifying these claims. After doing a lot of research, I came up short of any actual interviews. The closest we have is the voice actress for Pyra, Sky Bennett, saying as much on a live stream she did when the game first came out. Even then, I couldn't find the clip in question. It has to exist, right? I've seen so many people mention this online that it had to have actually happened, right? The stream archives do exist, so realistically, someone could watch through them and find where she said this. But Xenoblade 2 is like an 80-hour game, so you're literally looking for a needle in a haystack. Even without explicit confirmation, it's not hard to tell that the issues was in the voice direction rather than the actors. I don't want to give everyone the wrong impression here. The voice acting does get better as the game goes on. You can feel the actors become more comfortable with the roles they're playing as the story progresses. It's pretty cool to witness in real time the growth of the performances firsthand, but this does come with the consequences of some rather stilted delivery at the beginning of the game. I don't even find it to be as bad as some people say it is. I genuinely think it's a bit blown out of proportion, but if this isn't an awkward scream, then I don't know what is. So yeah, Xenoblade 2 doesn't exactly lead with its best foot forward. First impressions are extremely important, especially when you're asking players to sink about 100 hours into a game to get the most out of the experience. I personally know plenty of people that struggle to get truly invested into Xenoblade 2, whether that be because of the story not having that immediate hook to capture players, or because the combat wasn't to their liking. You know what? Let's cover that now because there's a lot to discuss. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 combat carries on the same basic framework that the original game has. You fight enemies in a real-time setting, only taking control of one character at a time, with the rest being handled by AI. Just like last time, there are two types of attacks. There's your basic auto attacks and your more advanced attacks known as arts. But the devil is in the details. One of the first things I noticed when booting up Xenoblade 2 after the first game was that it immediately addressed my issue with the cooldown timers. In Xenoblade 1, your arts functioned off of fixed cooldown rates, with no real method of controlling their recharge speed. If you used backslash right away, you have to wait a fixed amount of time before you can execute the skill again. Sure, you can upgrade the art to improve the cooldown rate, but it's such a negligible amount that most people won't even notice. This makes certain characters not all that fun to play as. Charla can be a very useful party member in the hands of the right player, but her long cooldown timers make her one of the less engaging party members to play as. I suggested back in my video on the first game that having arts charge up through auto attacks would have been an improvement, since it gives the player more control over the pacing of the fight. You want to use your arts? Land more hits on the enemy. Fuck, I guess I have foresight, since Xenoblade 2 ended up going with that exact direction, and it feels so much better because of it. By landing hits on enemies, your party members will build up their art charges, and once they're full, you can execute the art by pressing the corresponding button. A cool new addition is the ability to cancel auto attacks into arts. By timing your button presses at the end of an auto attack, you'll be able to transfer your action immediately into an art, while also keeping the damage scaling from the auto attacks. Time this at the end of the third stage of a combo and you'll get a hefty bonus in damage. It also just feels good to pull off thanks to the satisfying clang sound when you get the timing just right. Something that I do find to be a bit strange, however, is that you can't just cancel arts into other arts by default. Strangely enough, this is an ability that needs to be unlocked on a per character basis, and I can't quite say that I'm a huge fan of that decision. Having this upgrade is basically mandatory because enemies have a lot of health, so being able to expend all of your arts at once helps keep fights from dragging out too long. Arts by default don't necessarily have a lot of flow to them either. When you're first taught art canceling, your initial instinct is to try to cancel one art into another, and when that doesn't work, it just feels wrong. It feels like something that you should be able to do by default, and by locking that ability behind an upgrade, the early game just feels like you're being purposely gimped just to make said enhancement feel more worth it. It's an issue that's resolved as soon as you buy the upgrade, and I recommend to anyone playing this game to go for it as soon as you can. I just don't understand why it's not available by default, since it's a pretty easy technique for players to figure out on their own. Anyway, the main purpose of arts in this game, aside from their bonus effects, is to build up your special meter. This is the replacement for talent arts in the first game. Every blade has 4 special attacks. 3 of them can be used anytime as long as you build up your special meter to the right level. The 4th one is only accessible if you have a high affinity with that blade in combat. It's not too hard to build up, just do as many auto attack cancels as you can and score critical hits and you'll be good. Blade special attacks are extremely important for combat. By using a special art, you'll begin a blade combo. Depending on the element of the blade that's used to start the combo, you'll not only apply a special effect to the enemy, but it also determines the combo routes you can follow. For example, Pyra is a fire blade, so if you use her level 1 special to start a combo, then I'll need to follow it up with an appropriate element to continue the string. The combo string is determined purely by the starting element, so you need to make sure that your party has elemental synergy if you want to actually complete blade combos. Thankfully, Monolith Soft had the foresight to make your starting party members synergize with each other in that regard. While it is possible to complete a blade combo solely using the character that you're controlling, you're heavily encouraged to get everyone in on the action. Party members won't even use their special blade arts until directly instructed to by the player, so you're always able to strategize around the mechanic. When you complete a blade combo, you'll deal a massive amount of damage to that enemy. You're also rewarded with a bonus effect depending on the last element used in a combo. I personally never paid much attention to these, though they can be handy in some scenarios. What you're really looking for are those elemental orbs. Now, these might seem like more of a hindrance than a benefit initially. Whenever you finish a blade combo, an elemental orb of the attack used as the finisher will appear on the enemy. When this happens, all damage done by the corresponding element will be reduced significantly. At first, it might seem as though this mechanic exists to encourage players to switch to different blades to keep the damage up. In that sense, it succeeds, but at the cost of making it feel more like a punishment rather than a reward for playing well. However, once you unlock the ability to perform chain attacks, the true utility of elemental orbs becomes apparent. I was a little mixed on chain attacks in the original Xenoblade Chronicles. On one hand, it was a cool use of the party member affinity system, but at the same time, I felt as though the mechanic relied a little too much on random chance. It was a dice roll as to whether or not your chain would continue after those initial 3 hits. Sure, there was a way to guarantee a continuation, but you needed to essentially max out your entire party and grind to an unreasonable degree. Even so, you're only able to use chain attacks to their fullest extent during the endgame. The random nature of the system made it a pain to plan around, and I remember even suggesting back then that I would have preferred a more controllable method. Thankfully, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 does exactly that. Damn. maybe I can see the future. Instead of picking specific arts to use in a chain attack, you instead select which blade you want to attack with. Your goal is to destroy at least one elemental orb per round. If you manage to accomplish that, you'll be given the opportunity to continue the chain. Your attacks will even move up one stage in rank, and your blade will recharge if you pass the quick time event. If you manage to destroy enough elemental orbs in a chain attack, you'll trigger a full burst, with whoever landed the final hit being granted their level 4 super attack with that blade. There's a bit of a rock, paper, scissors dynamic going on. Normally, you can't target which orbs you want to attack unless you use a blade of the opposite element. For example, if you have an electric elemental orb set up on an enemy, then using an earth element blade will not only target that orb, but also inflict more damage on it, making it easier for your other party members to break it. There are quite a few rules to follow if you want to make the most out of your chain attacks. You need a team with good elemental synergy to set up orbs, but you also need to keep in mind how you're going to destroy them. The more orbs you destroy in one round, the faster you fill up the full burst gauge, and the higher your damage multiplier becomes. I've had chain attacks where my party was dealing more than 2,000% of their base damage with the right setup, and it feels amazing when you pull off a full burst. I vastly prefer this more puzzle-like setup to chain attacks. By having strict rules in place, they can be designed in a way where the chain attack length is determined entirely by player's skill rather than party affinity. If a chain attack cannot be continued, then I know that it's due to my own fault as a user rather than because I was denied it by the game. A new addition to chain attacks is the overkill status. If you kill an enemy during a chain, it doesn't immediately end, but rather than building up a damage multiplier, you instead build up a bonus rewards multiplier. This makes level grinding basically a non-issue and increases odds for getting some of those rare drops. Always be sure to overkill story bosses and unique monsters so you can maximize the rewards. Something that I appreciate about Xenoblade 2 is that it leans more into the absurd damage numbers that the first game had. It's mostly just a psychological thing, but being rewarded for playing well with massive damage numbers after a long string of attacks just feels so gratifying. A lot of people try to argue that larger damage numbers in some RPGs makes attacking in of itself feel meaningless. If the numbers are smaller, it makes every attack feel more impactful, since any amount of damage, regardless of how little, is meaningful. This is something that the Paper Mario games do, and while I believe it works in the context of a game like that, having smaller damage numbers in something like Xenoblade would diminish the game's sense of scale. In these games, you'll go from fighting crabs that you accidentally fished up, to fighting these otherworldly deities. As you move up the food chain and become king of the hill, your substantial increase in damage is meant to serve as a good reference point as to how strong these characters have become. Fighting giant mechs high in the sky would lose all of its impact if we were only dealing like 20 damage per attack. Imagine if you got to Zanza in the first game and he only had like 1,000 health. It would diminish his status as a godlike being that's a serious threat to the entire world. If I'm fighting a monster the size of a building, then it should stand to reason that it would have an insane amount of health and would require the best firepower to take down. These large damage numbers were something that the first game flirted with a bit, but it's something that the sequel really leans into. When pulling off a massive combo, the game will momentarily slow down so you can fully take in just how much striking force you have. Plus, it just feels good to see a big number, okay? Not everything needs to be a deep philosophical justification. They could jangle keys in my face for all I care, as long as the number attached is something ridiculously high. You might have noticed already that Xenoblade 2's combat system compounds on itself. There's a very clear flow for how the mechanics work. You auto-attack to build up arts, use arts to earn specials, which are then used to place elemental orbs on enemies, then finally use chain attacks to deal the big damage. It's certainly more involved than what the first game was going for with its combat. I'm not trying to put down Xenoblade 1 here because I still think that game has good systems, it's just that I found the second game to be a lot more my style, after I understood how to play. Alright, it's time to open up this can of worms. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is infamous for its tutorials. Not just because there are a lot of them, but because they flat out give you bad advice. When I announced on my Twitter that I was starting this game, I was flooded with so many people warning me about this fact. People were even suggesting me to do homework. You know, get a basic grasp on the systems through YouTube guides before diving in. While I appreciate you all for looking out for me, I gotta admit, it did make me a little curious. Going into this game, I decided to follow the tutorials as they were presented to me, mostly because I wanted to verify myself if the tutorials were really that bad. Xenoblade 2 does a fine enough job at teaching you the basics of the combat. It explains how the most important core systems function as they become relevant to the player. I don't necessarily think the game lies to you, rather it doesn't do a great job at emphasizing how important certain mechanics are. Driver combos are a huge example of this. A large part of this game's combat system are the break and topple status. Dare I say it's the backbone to the entire combat system. You're taught fairly early on that driver combos can be used to keep enemies in check and force them into vulnerable states for you to deal more damage. However, what Xenoblade 2 fails to communicate is how vital driver combos are to dealing solid damage. By combining driver combos with blade combos, you'll end up performing fusion combos. The game tells you about this pretty early on, but it fails to go into detail as to why you should be doing these. Fusion combos provide a lot of different bonus effects to the player, such as increasing the raw damage dealt to an enemy, making damage over time effects more potent, and you'll even spawn bonus health potions around the arena with each stage the driver portion of the combo increases. On the flip side, if you go through the entire blade combo chart off of a driver combo, you'll be granted an insane damage boost. For how important fusion combos are to the combat system, you're not very well encouraged by the game itself to make the most out of them. The closest you'll find is a single blurb at the start of the game. You don't even have all the game's mechanics unlocked at this point, and the tutorial itself doesn't give you any practical examples of how this system can be applied in combat. Don't even get me started on the pouch items. These are by far some of the most important items in combat, and the game does such a bad job at telling you this. Art recharge desserts are incredibly useful in almost every scenario. They're damn near mandatory if you want the battles to keep a consistent pace. But once again, the game fails to convey this information to the player. The tutorial that teaches you about this mechanic forces you to buy such a shitty pouch item. It gives newcomers the wrong idea, making them think that pouch items aren't worth bothering with when in fact they greatly benefit you. The item descriptions also do a poor job with conveying their effects. Narsapear Jelly is one of the best pouch items in the game, but its effect looks really bad if you don't already understand how art recharge rates work. This number will mean nothing to a new player, and they would have been better off just changing it to a percentage speed rather than some decimal shit. Sure, it's technically less accurate because it's not exactly how the time works, but it'll be immediately recognizable as a very good effect. There are so many people who got the wrong impression from Xenoblade 2 because the game does a poor job at conveying how you're actually supposed to play the damn thing. In a way, it lends the game a sense of community. You know, if I find out a cool trick, I can then show it to my friend if he's struggling, and vice versa. There are full YouTube channels dedicated to teaching players how to properly approach Xenoblade 2's combat system. And while it's cool to see that fans are willing to teach newcomers this stuff, you shouldn't have to do homework just to understand the basics. It also sucks that there's no way to review these tutorials in-game. Once you've read it the first time, that's it. It's gone forever. So you better be sure you've grasped what the game was trying to tell you in that moment, because that's your only shot. God forbid if you put the game down for a bit and want a refresher on the basics. The opening hours can be such a slog, tutorial after tutorial. And when you finally sit down and try to learn how to play Xenoblade 2, it isn't that much more complicated than the first game. The issue is the lack of conveyance, and no easy way to access some vital information. There's no elemental chart to reference for blade combos before starting one off. This means when building a team with elemental and blade synergy, you either have to have all of the possible paths already memorized, or you do what I did and download a custom-made chart off the internet to reference. Decide to wing it, and there's a chance you'll end up starting a blade combo that you can't even finish. And with no way to cancel a combo, you just have to sit there and wait for the timer to die out. Maybe the bad tutorials and lack of proper guidance is just a consequence of the game's strained development. Apparently, 3 programmers left in the middle of production, and these were the guys working on the UI, which is a very important part of a role-playing game. I wouldn't be surprised if it had to be quickly cobbled together at the last second to meet that December deadline. And if that is the case, then I do understand why it ended up the way it did. But I'm surprised to see that after years of updates and DLC, some basic stuff still wasn't included. Improvements were made, that's for sure. I hear horror stories about the game's 1.0 release. But I'm blown away that they never had an option to rewatch tutorials, or even offer any advanced ones for those who really got into the game's systems. Yeah, the tutorials of Xenoblade 2 aren't very good, and if I'm gonna levy other complaints about the combat, then I have to mention how slow it feels at the start. For the sake of not overwhelming players, Xenoblade 2 drip feeds its mechanics. While this accomplishes the goal of easing players in, ultimately, it just takes too long for the combat to find its footing. The original Xenoblade established all of its core mechanics at the very start of the game. From then on, complexity was introduced through the acquisition of new party members. The fundamentals never changed, but the amount of options the player has is expanded. Xenoblade 2 purposely gimps the player, holding back on important mechanics until you reach a certain point in the story. The reason why people say this game gets better at Chapter 4 is because that's when you have access to most of your kit. With the exception being one or two stragglers, but I'm gonna excuse those because they're late game abilities that don't completely change the gameplay. I wish there was an expert mode that unlocked every core mechanic from the start. That way, repeat runs wouldn't be as tedious for returning players, or for people just looking to spice things up with early chain attacks. With that being said, when you finally have all of the tools unlocked and you fully understand how you're supposed to engage with enemies, this game is so fucking fun, dude. It's fast-paced, hectic fun that cuts out a lot of the more annoying aspects of the original game and cranks its strengths up to an 11, and I already really enjoyed the combat of the first game. The moment-to-moment combat has a lot of bite to it thanks to the weighty and impactful attack animations and sound design. Once you get the hang of things and make proper character builds, all of the downtime in combat is completely removed. Some might find the reliance on art spam to be a little cheesy, and it is, but it's fun and still challenging enough to not be considered brain dead. But on the topic of difficulty, I will admit that this game is a lot easier than the first one, at least in regards to the main campaign. Levels mattered a lot in the first Xenoblade, arguably more than they should have. Xenoblade 2 scales this back quite a bit through smarter stat balancing, though unlike the first one, it's a lot easier to become overleveled. I went out of my way to do a bunch of optional shit in this game, and since I had the expansion pass installed, some of the quests would net quite a bit of experience. There's also this new inn system in case you're struggling. Bonus experience that you accrue throughout your journey through Alrest can be cashed in whenever you visit an inn. It works wonders if you find yourself falling behind the level curve, but maybe not try to use this too much. During my playthrough of the game, I ended up becoming a bit overleveled because I was using the bonus experience more than I should have. I ended up running past quite a few encounters during later chapters in an attempt to balance things out, only going out of my way to overkill bosses since you can't rematch them. There was no point where I ever had to grind, which is a good thing for those who just want to blast through the campaign. A cool feature in New Game Plus is that this bonus experience is actually currency for some exclusive items, and you can even level down if you want to give yourself more of a challenge. I like it. But if you found the campaign to be too easy, then there's still some optional challenges to sink your teeth into. At launch, there was a multiple of super bosses that scale way above your level cap, and require a lot of thinking to take down correctly. If you bought the expansion pass, then you also have access to the challenge battles, and these are where the real source of difficulty comes from. Challenge battles lock your party to a specific level, meaning that it all comes down to your builds more than anything. These things are brutal, even with endgame equipment. They're designed for master players, but thankfully there are easier variants of these challenges if you find yourself truly struggling. What's sick about the challenge mode is that Shulk and Fiora from the original game are blades that you can use. There's even a cutscene introducing them, and it's sick to see the new characters interact with the old ones. Not gonna lie, it made me really happy seeing this stuff for the first time. Is this challenge room in the base game or is this all DLC? Okay. I'm surprised they put in like an actual cutscene. By finishing all of the challenge battles, you're able to take Shulk and Fiora out of the arena and have them be permanent blades in your arsenal. While I don't have time to do this now, it's certainly on the bucket list. What's cool is that Shulk and Fiora aren't the only guest blades in the game either. The character Elma from Xenoblade X is here, and even has access to one of that game's core mechanics. And then there's Cosmos and Telos from Xenosaga of all things, and she's damn near the best blade in the game. This is a super cool way of referencing other games in a franchise. It reminds me of that one DLC from Shin Megami Tensei 4 Apocalypse, where you get to team up with some of the protagonists from previous games. I love stuff like this, and it's cool to see Monolith Soft acknowledge their past history like this. Surprised to see no Xenogears rep, but since Square owns that game, it probably was a rights thing. Crossover stuff like this costs quite a bit of money and usually isn't worth it. So I wouldn't be surprised if Monolith did reach out to Square, but they couldn't come to an agreement. When the game first came out, the only crossover blade was Cosmos, and aside from Mithra, she was the only other light element blade in the entire game, making her already someone you'd want to get regardless of her amazing stats. But here's the thing, you're not getting Cosmos. And why is that? Because it's all down to luck. Alright, let's talk about core crystals. So, in the world of Xenoblade 2, drivers need to resonate with core crystals to obtain blades. This is shown very early on in the story, and is something that's brought up quite a few times. In an attempt to combine story and gameplay together, you're also able to resonate with core crystals to obtain new blades for your party. It's essentially like a gacha pull. Whatever blade you obtain from a core crystal is completely random. There are two types of blades. There are the common blades, which have randomized stats, elements, class, weapon type, and all that junk. And then there are the elusive rare blades. These are the grand prize for hitting it big on the Xenoblade 2 slot machine. These blades have fixed stats, dedicated rules in combat, and are overall more desirable than the basic common blades. In theory, I actually really like this concept. It adds a layer of personalization to every playthrough. No two players are going to have the same experience because of these random elements. You're forced to make the best with what you have, or wait until you're near the end of the game when Rex is able to wield any blade regardless of who it's assigned to. It makes our heroes feel like scrappy adventurers, using only what they have at their disposal. Common blades aren't something to immediately write off either. Sure, a lot of them are kind of garbage, but you'll occasionally come across a common blade that has a few really good qualities to it. Orb Master is a skill that's exclusive to common blades, and if you want to build up chain attacks quickly, a blade with this passive is invaluable. Even if a common blade isn't the best for combat, the stat modifiers that they come with can help out certain party compositions tremendously. I get the idea behind the system, but ultimately I can't quite say that I'm a fan of it for numerous reasons. Number 1, field skills. I fuck with this idea heavily in concept. Blades are just as much tools for everyday life as they are weapons for combat. When field skills are used to enhance a character's ability to make tasks easier, then they're great. There are field skills that get you more items from collection points, and ones that help you out with salvaging good items from the Cloud Sea. Stuff like this is inoffensive because you can still accomplish your goal without the skill. All having them does is make your life a little easier. It's when field skills are used in map navigation when it goes from a cool feature to an obnoxious one. Occasionally you'll come across these areas that you can only access with the right set of field skills. If you don't have the right one set, then you can pause the game and change your loadout to meet the requirement. The issue is that field skill checks are very frequent, and they break the game's pacing something fierce. Some areas, like the Kingdom of Tantil, require excessive use of field skills of different categories if you want to explore everywhere on the map. While you can have your reserve party members equip all the junk blades to help you with these checks, it doesn't fully fix the issue. You will find yourself pausing the game every few minutes just to change your blade loadout, only to immediately change it back once you finish the check. Sure, you can sort by your favorite blades to quickly re-engage your loadout, but it doesn't cut down that much on menu management, especially if you're like me and had a lot of favorites saved for different situations. The exploration would have benefited greatly if you could just save preset loadouts for your characters that you could switch between easily. You know, have one loadout for battles and have a few available for field skill management. That way we can quickly change our setups instead of having to spend a few minutes to switch around everyone's blades. Also a small thing, but I don't think the game does a good enough job at providing context behind certain field skills. Using a field skill to destroy a tree blocking your path makes a lot of sense. It's not something that the characters could do on their own, so they need a little bit of help. But why do I need to use a specific set of blades if I want to jump up a ladder? Doesn't Rex have a grappling hook that he uses to do just that in the main story? Also, Poppy can fly. She could just carry everyone up if she wanted to. Is there a field skill to help me with my depression? I get that this doesn't matter in the long run, but Xenoblade 2 was pretty good at providing story context for its gameplay decisions everywhere else in the game, but not here for some reason. It just sticks out as a blemish to me. But the thing is, what field skills you do have access to is entirely determined by what blades you end up pulling from core crystals. Since common blades have randomized stats and skills, there will be chances where you simply just won't have the right skills to explore the area. I got lucky and pulled a common blade with both leaping and wind mastery, but another player might just pull common blades with a single field skill. Since it comes down to the luck of the draw, you're just gonna have to pull blades and hope for the best. It's a bit defeating when I'm not allowed to explore an area, not out of a lack of skill, but because the game refuses to give me the proper blades to do so.
Let's go gambling!
Aw, dang it. Aw, dang it. Aw, dang it. Aw.
Number 2, Blade Quests. Every rare blade in the game has a side quest associated with them. This is an awesome idea since we get a much better view of the blade as a character rather than as a tool. A big theme in Xenoblade 2's story is that drivers and blades aren't all that different and should be treated as equals, so these quests serve the purpose of demonstrating that theme. But the issue is that you can't access that blade side quest unless you got lucky enough to pull them from the gacha system. This makes getting 100% in Xenoblade 2 a fucking nightmare because yes, most rare blades are obtained through core crystals with only a few exceptions. You shouldn't be locked out of meaningful content like this just because you're unable to pull the correct blade. There are ways to sway the odds in your favor, like using higher quality core crystals, maxing out your luck stat, and idea stat boosters, but you can't guarantee blade pulls outside of the first few pity blades you're given. Xenoblade Chronicles 1 is a game that can be fully completed with time and dedication. Sure, it's not something that I have the time for right now, but it's something that I can realistically see myself doing. Xenoblade 2, on the other hand, is a game that I don't think I'll ever even attempt to 100%, and a lot of that has to boil down to elements that are outside of my control. Even if I were to ignore it, a lot of this game's optional content isn't the best. It's a lot of the same shit from the original game. Kill X amount of enemies, farm for this item, go back and forth between 2 locations like 10 fucking times in a row. Maybe the stories are a bit more involved this time around, but it's hard to appreciate that when the game design surrounding these quests is relatively boring. If the quest doesn't involve combat in some way, then I find myself mentally tuning out. I don't mind when games break out of their standard formula for some variety, but when the side quests also find themselves falling into a dull pattern, then I don't feel all that encouraged to play through them. The Blade quests are the most impressive side activities to me, since they're all these multi-stage stories that provide some extra nuance we wouldn't get before. But again, it all comes down to which rare blades you have unlocked and how strong your affinity is with them. Even after all of that though, I ended up spending a lot of time doing the side activities. I don't know why, but Xenoblade Chronicles side quests are extremely addicting to complete. It creates this weird feeling in me where I can reflect back and realize that they're not all that great. But in the moment, I can't help but do any and all of them that I come across. I maxed out all of the development levels, completed a nice chunk of Merc missions, bought a bunch of the shop deeds and all that jazz. Even in between writing this video, I've been casually sinking my teeth into the post-game challenges before going to bed. I think that's a sign that I enjoy Xenoblade 2's gameplay despite its faults and strange design decisions. In a lot of ways, I find Xenoblade 2 to be a massive step up from the original game, but at the same time, I can acknowledge that it's more so a roller coaster rather than an outright improvement. The game has a specific vision in mind. It's unapologetically trying to appeal to a certain market, and there's a very high chance that you aren't a part of it. It's a bit of a mess, with ideas that are poorly explained or didn't have the most amount of thought put into them. However, it's hard for me to hate those lesser qualities because of how earnest the game is. Passion isn't exactly something that can be quantified and measured, but it's something that people are able to detect while experiencing a piece of art. Doing some research into the trials that the developers faced during production has also allowed me to rationalize why some things are the way they are. Of course, you don't have to like it or even get it, but having that understanding and open-mindedness when going into something that's trying to be unconventional might make you enjoy it a little more. The worst thing that'll happen is that you don't like it and you can just move on with your life. It's interesting to see Tetsuya Takahashi mention the same thing in regards to the narrative. When asked what emotions he wanted the players to feel while experiencing his games, Takahashi ended up refusing to answer. He said that he values other people's interpretations of his art, and doesn't make absolutist statements because he doesn't believe in doing that, even openly admitting that he's surprised to see what some people took away from the game. While there is undoubtedly a message that's trying to be expressed in Xenoblade 2, Takahashi's stance on the matter is really interesting, and one that I agree with. The point of my videos are to express my own emotions and interpretations of this art form. I'm not the kind of guy that wants to tell people what to think about something. Rather, I just like to give my own perspective, and if you end up resonating with that, then that's great, but if not, then it's just as valid. I'm not about to make some objective statement on the story or anything. I'm more so interested in talking about how it made me feel. With that said, spoilers! A lot has been said about Xenoblade Chronicles 2's tonal dissonance. While it's true that both games are ultimately ones about questioning and critiquing the world's status quo, the major difference is that the first game was a serious story with some levity, while the second one starts off as a rather lighthearted adventure before evolving into something more complex. People who were big fans of that first game were immediately hit with a shock upon booting up Xenoblade 2. We've gone from a war between two races to a plucky adventure story with a colorful cast of characters with a surprising amount of humor. Obviously, the entire story isn't like this, but those opening chapters certainly give off the wrong first impressions. I think the reason behind this decision was for two reasons. Firstly, there's Tetsuya Takahashi's creative process that I brought up earlier, but also, I think Monolith Soft was trying to mislead people, set up an expectation that Xenoblade 2 was going to be a completely standalone game, not unlike X was back on the Wii U, only to pull the rug out from under players once the game was released. The only evidence I have for this are the advertisements and fan reactions to them. There's nothing indicating that Xenoblade 2 was going to be a direct sequel to the first game other than what? A number? The game just looked and felt so different from the original that there's no way it could be connected, and people back then thought the exact same thing. You're meant to play through Xenoblade 2 without any expectations of it being a sequel to the first one, only to have that facade be dropped during the game's final few chapters. It's a cool meta-narrative, but the real reason behind the more jovial opening hours is probably much more simple. Just like in real life, the world of Alrest is filled with highs and lows. Sometimes there's good days, and sometimes there's bad days. One minute you're living your best life with the people you love, and suddenly it can all come crashing down. But the reverse is also true. When the going gets rough and you feel like you're at your lowest, it's always good to receive reminders of those good times, having a group of loyal companions by your side to help pick yourself back up. The world isn't black and white, it's a gradient of all sorts of people and emotions, and Xenoblade 2 does a good job at highlighting that. At least thematically it does, because literally speaking, it's a bit rocky. A lot of people describe Xenoblade 2 as too anime, which I feel like is a blanket term. I don't think I've met anyone that's able to properly describe what exactly that means, but if certain tropes featured in this game are anything to go by, then maybe I can see it. The cast of Xenoblade 2, at least for the first part of the story, borrows a lot from popular tropes. There's a wide-eyed protagonist with a strong conviction, a caring motherly figure, a wise mentor figure who is struck down by the main villain, partially motivating a revenge angle from the protagonist. A lot of what you would see in anime, both old and new, is represented here. I think the largest influence from anime and manga is from the game's style of humor. It reminds me a lot of early Dragon Ball in the sense that fan service or sexual innuendos is often the punchline. I'm not some prude that hates this stuff or anything, but it really isn't my thing. I have no right to judge anyone for enjoying this stuff either. Persona 4 is one of my favorite games, and it also features some stuff like this. It's easy for me to overlook some cringy humor every now and again, but I totally get why some people will be put off by Blushy Crushy or some other crap like that.
Did I what? You've got a lot of nerve, you one-eyed monster.
Nia, you do know one-eyed monster usually means...
Huh? Means what?
It's, Mithra, why are you blushing?
Shut up!
Get it? The joke is that they're talking about penises! I think Xenoblade 2's larger emphasis on humor can easily lead into the topic of party members. Xenoblade 1 was a game that took itself pretty seriously. It wasn't devoid of humor, but it wasn't the priority of the story. The only constant source of comic relief in the game was Ricky, and even then, he's meant to be the exception. When everyone is taking the situation at face value and are on edge for most of the journey, having Ricky there provides some necessary levity to keep things from becoming too grimdark. Sure, the game thrives with its serious tone and message, but too much of a good thing can make you sick of it, you know? In contrast, everyone in Xenoblade 2 are these eccentric personalities. They've got loud character designs that all call for your attention, big expressive eyes, and wildly bouncy animations. The thing about comic relief is that it should be used sparingly if you want your story to keep that serious tone. A character like Zeke should work really well, but his antics aren't any more or less exaggerated than the other characters in the game, which is weird because when he's first introduced, him and Pandoria are meant to strike that Team Rocket dynamic. He's meant to be treated like a joke at first, but it doesn't land all too well when everyone is used for comic relief at some point or another. The only straight man, or woman in this case, is Morag, an Imperial general who holds her status in high regard. She shows undying loyalty to her government, and will do anything that it takes to protect the Morardain Empire and its citizens. She works well to reel back the wackiness that exists in the main party. She's like the opposite of Ricky in that regard. That's not to say that these characters lack depth, because they are layered. Very layered, actually. Every one of them is dealing with a personal struggle, one that the player might find themselves relating to. Tora battles with feelings of insecurity. He wants to be seen as a hero and believes the only way to accomplish this is to become a driver. Since he can't resonate with core crystals, he ends up completing the artificial blade that his grandfather left behind. But even with the power of a blade by his side, he still struggles to find what exactly it means to be a hero. Is beating up bad guys truly enough? Tora ends up taking a liking to Rex and views him as a goal to achieve for himself. There's even a full chapter dedicated to those insecurities, and even once his time in the spotlight is over, he still uses his genius to upgrade Poppies in ways to keep up with the rest of the cast. That's good characterization. Say what you want about Tora's voice acting or his perverted comments, but you can't deny that he isn't a well-rounded character. I have the same compliments towards every member of the cast. Nia battles with her identity as a flesh eater, denying her true self because she believes that her abilities as a blade has caused nothing but suffering and hardship to those around her. Zeke is ashamed of his heritage because the backbone of his family is built on lies and deceit. Pyra and Mithra fear their power. While I won't go into that just yet, their bottled up emotions are one of the key pillars to the story. Characters are goofy, yes, but there's a lot more to them beneath those layers.
The way you Nopon speak is so funny. Tora do this, Tora do that.
Zeke! What the fuck? You can't say that! Xenoblade 2 has a very similar philosophy to the first game with how its characters are portrayed. Usually they'll have a section of the story dedicated solely to them before switching focus back to Rex, Pyra, and Mithra. But this doesn't mean that they just stop existing in the party. While their significance in the main plot is scaled back once they've had their moment in the sun, if you want to get the most out of the characters, then you need to do some of the heart-to-heart events. I'm glad that this game made them more accessible than last time. In the original game, you needed to have a certain affinity level between characters if you wanted to view these bonus scenes. While not mandatory viewing to understand the characters, these scenes add a lot of texture to the world. Xenoblade 2 removes the affinity requirement, and just asks the player to visit heart-to-hearts whenever they get the chance to. I liked them back then, and I like them just as much here. But now they have the benefit of being fully voiced, so that's cool. Interestingly enough, blades themselves also have heart-to-heart events. This allows you to learn more about the blade's personality and further humanizes them, making them feel more like people rather than weapons. This is actually a constant theme throughout Xenoblade 2. While the game's narrative is proposed to be this think piece about overpopulation and lack of living space, ultimately, it's more so a story about what it means to be human. Blades are an important part of Xenoblade 2's world. They're used as weapons for war, tools to help out with everyday life, or even a strong companion to emotionally support you. But the point that Xenoblade 2 wants to make is that regardless of the emotion and humanity blades display, large chunks of the population view them as lesser. Blades can't exist without a driver to resonate with them after all, so the self-serving and greedy take advantage of that. They view blades as tools that can be mass-produced to fulfill the user's desires. Chapter 4 even demonstrates this when the party visits a factory that has the sole purpose of creating artificial blades. However, what Xenoblade 2 goes out of its way to demonstrate is that, despite their otherworldly powers, blades are just as humans as the drivers that they resonate with. Blades have wants, fears, desires, and personalities. The blades in your party are just as much characters as everyone else is, and the same is true for every blade you come across. This is why they all have these in-depth side quests. It's meant to hammer in the idea that yes, these guys are alive and should be treated as such. Though not everyone in Alrest sees this. Blades are not allowed to just exist, since they all need to be registered with the government. Being a driver with an unregistered blade is seen as a crime, further dehumanizing blades by treating them solely as weapons. One of the most interesting aspects of blades to me is their opinion on death. Blades are technically immortal. They can't be killed. Rather, once the driver passes away, the blade will return to its core crystal where it can then be reawakened. However, upon doing so, the blade's previous memories are wiped clean from their mind, almost as if they're born anew. Some blades view this never-ending cycle as a curse. Since blades have the same emotions and personalities that humans have, it's easy for them to develop emotional attachments to their current life. Drivers are their lifelong companions, and the memories they made through their journey together are among some of the most cherished. It's completely understandable why blades wouldn't want to forget those memories when reborn. Their whole life would vanish in an instant, and when they come back, they have no idea who they were prior. Imagine if one day you woke up and suddenly your life was completely different. New family, new friends, with no inkling of their previous life. Almost like a dream that fades away with time. Some blades take matters into their own hands and chronicle their life cycle so that they can hopefully be able to recall who they used to be. But it's not a surefire plan, since it all hinges on that diary following them to their next driver. Maybe this could be a good thing if their previous driver was a monster. A horrible human that forces the blade to commit terrible acts. If a blade wants to permanently rid themselves of that trauma, then they could just kill their driver. It wouldn't be the first time that's happened either. This is where Torna comes into play. While at first their motives are shrouded in mystery, it's eventually revealed that the terrorist organization consists of rogue blades. Jin is a tragic character. Despite his edgy design, his motivations for ending up the way he did is genuinely heartbreaking. Around 500 years ago, Jin was awakened by a small girl named Laura. As she grew older, the two formed a familial bond, and fought alongside the previous Aegis wielder Adam and Mithra in a war against Malos. Jin was a kind-hearted man. He always extended a hand when needed and swore to protect those close to him. While Jin knew the cycle of life and death that blades go through, he tried his hardest to not let that define his life. After the war was over, Amalthus ordered an attack to attempt to destroy the Aegis, but Jin and Laura are caught in the crossfire. Jin, not wanting to forget Laura and the rest of his memories, consumes the driver's heart and transforms himself into a flesh eater, a blade that's able to exist without a driver. Because of humanity's violence and lack of care for blades, Jin teams up with Malos and vows to destroy all of humanity for their sins. This makes Jin a rather compelling villain to me. He's a tragic character. He suffered a lot, and it's easy to see how he developed such a disdain for the people who took away the one he loved the most. When Jin is first introduced as an antagonist, it's easy to assume that he just wants to wipe out the world for his own greater good. Though, as the game goes on and we learn more about him, that's not the full truth. Jin's hurt. He's suffering, and he wants nothing more than for all to end. This doesn't redeem him as a person, nor do the characters even try to pretend he had a good cause, but having that better understanding of his motive humanizes him. It's easy to forget that Jin is a blade in every single encounter with him. You're meant to be convinced that he's a regular human, but he's not, however. Does that difference even matter? The later chapters blur the line between humans and blades. They're one and the same, but it's the world and people who live in it that treat them as if they are separate. Jin wants to go to Elysium and kill the architect. However, he also wants answers as to why blades were made like this and why they have to suffer. That's what I call an interesting conflict, because Jin isn't exactly wrong, he's just horribly misguided and isn't thinking clearly. He's traumatized, emotionally broken, becoming the monster that ruined his own life. Hurt people end up hurting more people, and that's demonstrated throughout the game. Amalthus is the way he is because his mother had her life taken away by bandits. Jin and Amalthus have a very similar outlook on humanity. Both of them were harmed by awful people, but where they go wrong is that they lump all of humanity under that umbrella. Their suffering is then manifested through violence, and whether they like it or not, they're continuing the cycle that they wanted to destroy. That's where our heroes come into play. They're able to represent the good that humanity has to offer and act as the catalyst to bring out great changes within Alrest. A lot of people have said great things about the Torna expansion that released a year after the game came out. Supposedly, it fleshes out Jin a lot more than the main story did, while also giving more screen time to Mithra. To be honest, I haven't played the DLC just yet. Don't get me wrong, I want to, but it's a little far beyond the scope of this video. I already feel as though the game does a good enough job at establishing Jin's motivations and purpose in the story. I don't feel like the story is incomplete without Torna, but I have no doubts that it's a worthwhile expansion. I wanted to mostly focus on the base Xenoblade 2 experience for this video. Plus, I also just bought a Dreamcast, so I'm a little broke right now. I want to give special mention to Rex in this story. A lot of people found him to be a rather lacking protagonist, and while I will admit I don't find him to be the most compelling character in the world, I do think he works well for the story he's involved in. Shulk was a tough act to follow. He was a rather unconventional protagonist, one motivated by a thirst for revenge before his curiosity manages to bring about great changes in the world. Shulk was such a compelling character to me because he was a flawed hero, but one that was always willing to learn more about the world around him. While emotionally driven in a lot of ways, ultimately, his level-headedness and sense of curiosity was invaluable to bringing about change, learning to forgive and move on from the sins of the past. In comparison, Rex is a more traditional shonen protagonist. In a lot of ways, he reminds me of Sora from the Kingdom Hearts games. Both of these are wide-eyed teenage protagonists that have a firm conviction and beliefs. Hell, Rex even has the same battle stance as Sora, funnily enough. The reason why these two characters work in their respective stories is because they aren't about them changing as people. Rather, it's how their actions can change the outlook on others. Rex is someone who is optimistic to a fault. The reason why these globe-trotting RPGs focus on younger characters is because they haven't been jaded by the world just yet. They're young and a bit immature, but they have a sense of purity due to a lack of experience. For Rex, his journey through Alrest starts as a grand adventure seeing all sorts of new sights, though he quickly finds himself in over his head. The real world is a lot more complicated than what he first realized. However, Rex isn't the one who managed to change. It's the world itself that's flawed, and he's meant to be the one to bring about a more optimistic future. That doesn't mean he's a flat character that never has his low point, because he does, but his strong moral compass and desire for a better future isn't a flaw with him. I still find Shulk to be a more interesting and compelling protagonist, but I don't think Rex is a bad character. You guys are just mean. Though he does still go through a change in the story, and all that has to do with his relationship with Pyra and Mithra. Rex's journey through Alrest has him learn to trust his partners and eventually gain a deeper understanding of them. Pyra's initial request to go to Elysium and meet the architect isn't something that Rex questions all too much. He just views it as something that she wants to do, but doesn't fully grasp why. But at the same time as this, both Pyra and Mithra struggle to express their true emotions to Rex. The real reason why Pyra wants to go to Elysium is so that she can die. When Malos was defeated back in the Aegis War, Mithra's overwhelming power caused the death of the Torna Titan. Fearing the power she had access to, Mithra sealed her true power away in her subconscious, and created Pyra as a limiter of sorts. These two characters are meant to be two sides of the same coin, one personality represented in two different forms. Pyra is the more caring and sociable side, and Mithra is the more headstrong and commanding one. While people treat these two personalities as different characters, hell, even I do, it's not exactly true. The entire point of Mithra is that she learns to accept both sides of herself instead of gating them off. She struggles a lot to express her feelings, and whenever the time comes for sentimentality, you'll see Pyra take over. Just like when it's time to throw down, that's usually when Mithra takes command. But what's really cool about this character is that as the game goes on, the lines slowly blur a bit. Pyra becomes more assertive and Mithra is more sensitive to emotions. All of this happens because of the time they spend with Rex. As the trio is able to learn about and understand each other on a deeper level, Mithra and Pyra are able to become whole. Those self-inflicted barriers are eroded to the point where those two halves can once again become whole, and when that happens, Numa is born. The culmination of both Pyra and Mithra, the true form of the Aegis. Yeah, I bet you weren't expecting that out of a game that has this shit in it. The point I'm trying to make with all this is that Xenoblade 2 has a lot of interesting things to say if you're willing to stick with it. I understand being turned off from those opening hours because yeah, they are pretty rough. I fully get why some people just don't like it that much. But if you were to ask me, the only crime that this story makes is that it's kind of cringy sometimes. A lot of that power of friendship speak, and some characters aren't the most fleshed out. In a perfect world, those issues wouldn't exist, but I still think that this story does a lot more good than bad. Just like the first game, I find that Xenoblade 2 manages to garner an emotional reaction from people really well. The story can be pretty confusing at times, maybe a little contrived. It doesn't exactly have the greatest dialogue in the world either, but when it matters most, Xenoblade 2 is able to lock in and deliver on most of the ideas present. Just like with the combat, the story is told with so much earnesty and great moments that you can easily tell that the people who worked on the game genuinely believed in it. It just doesn't have the greatest execution in a lot of areas, but when Xenoblade 2 sticks the landing, it's actually rather clever. I mentioned it a bit earlier, but the way Xenoblade 2 ties into the original game is pretty genius, and I wasn't expecting the twist at all. At the end of the original game, we learn of a scientist named Klaus, a man who abandoned his world to create a new one where he ruled as a god. Xenoblade 2 retroactively adds more to that plot point. It turns out that underneath the Cloud Sea exist remnants of that old world, with the old humans being morphed into these alien-like monsters. Not only that, but it turns out that the architect is Klaus. When the conduit was used, Klaus's body was fractured into two, one half being transported into the new world where he became Zanza, and the other half remaining in the original world, now with the powers of a god. When the characters come face to face with the architect, they learn the true purpose of the Cloud Sea, what blades are meant to be used for, and where Malos and Mithra came from. There's even hints of a third Aegis that vanished a long time ago, and if you played Xenoblade Definitive Edition, you might have noticed a familiar shape on a special character. It's worth noting that the version of the conduit seen in Xenoblade 2 has a rather different context than in the original game. In the sequel, Klaus attempts to spin his use of the conduit as something that he did to benefit mankind. While some might call this a retcon, I actually don't fully agree with this for one reason. I don't think the architect is a reliable narrator. We get to see two different versions of this scene, but what's important to note is the context behind them. In Xenoblade 1, Shulk is shown a literal version of the past thanks to Alvis. We get to see firsthand what Klaus did to accomplish his goals, while in Xenoblade 2, the story is relayed directly from the architect with an accompanying flashback. The key difference between these two scenes is that one is from the perspective of a selfish man that managed to accomplish his goals, while the other is from the outcome where he failed. The architect has had many years to reflect on those events, and he's filled with regret. However, I don't think he's fully accepted that he had selfish intentions, and is looking for some sort of justification behind his actions. Maybe at some point, Klaus wanted to make a new world for mankind, but as we eventually see from his ego, those good intentions fell by the wayside to satiate his curiosity and thirst for power. Ultimately, the architect was looking to atone for his sins and wanted to give humanity a second chance. While he believed that they failed their test initially, it's because of Rex and his party that he's able to have a change of heart and learns to entrust the future into the hands of flawed humans. I like this contrast between the architect and Zanza. It's pretty similar to Pyra and Mithra in a way, a fractured soul personified in two completely different personalities. It's only when the two come together when the true self is made more apparent. There's no concrete evidence for this comparison other than some thematic parallels, but it's a little food for thought. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is a bit of a mess. Regardless of which camp you're a part of, I'm sure we can all agree on that standpoint. From my perspective, Xenoblade 2 was filled with a lot more good than bad for me. In a lot of ways, I find this game to be an ideal sequel, and I respect the creative decisions made for the sake of artistic freedom. It's a game that's not worried too much about chasing the same magic that the original game did, which is something that quite a few games fall victim to. It's not afraid to experiment or get weird with its mechanics and design for the sake of crafting a unique experience. For the most part, I believe Xenoblade 2 succeeds in that mission statement. When everything clicks together, the combat is a lot of fun. It's really rewarding once you fully understand how to properly play the game. There's a lot of cool customization available, multiple weapon types to try out for each character, but at the same time, there's a noticeable lack of polish. The tutorials are very bad at teaching you how to play the game properly. The gacha system is really dumb, and if I see one more field skill, the same points apply to the story too. When the story is good, it's really good. There's a lot of great character moments in here and some interesting philosophical topics. The latter half of the game is filled with bangers, to the point where it's easy to forgive some of the shortcomings. However, if you want to get to the really good shit, then you've got to commit, and I get that most people don't want to do that. I fully understand and get why some people just won't jive with this game. Remember, I tried playing this game years ago and fell off rather quickly. It does take a while for things to really kick into gear, both in terms of narrative and gameplay. It's a little unreasonable to ask people to sink upwards of 10+ hours into a game they're not enjoying just to get to the good stuff. RPGs are long, and most people just don't have the time to sink into something that doesn't immediately grab them. Plus, since this is a Nintendo game, you bet your ass that's never going down in price. Not only is it a time investment, but a financial one too! If you end up giving this game a shot thanks to this video, then I sincerely hope you enjoy it. And if you don't, hey, at least you gave it a fair shake. It's not for everyone, that's for sure. And you know what? I wouldn't have it any other way. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I'd like to give a special shout out to all of my channel supporters for being the most patient and caring people in the world. It's because of all of you that I'm in the position that I am now, and I can't thank you all enough for the support. If you want to join the ranks of these legends, then consider joining my Patreon or becoming a channel member. You'll get some pretty sick benefits like early access to new videos, ooh. You can find out more by following the links in the description. Sorry if I sound out of it right now. It's 7 in the morning as I record this, and I am so fucking tired. I stayed up all night trying to finish this, and I am just fucking dead at this point. Right after I'm done this, I'm just gonna head straight to bed. So, this video took much longer than I was expecting. Not only was the length longer than I thought it was going to be, but also because of some recent events in my personal life ended up pushing it back even further than I wanted it to. To make a long story short, I haven't exactly been in the best place recently. I like to try to keep a 1 video a month upload schedule, but lately I've been failing at that. There have been 2 months now that went without any videos or streams or really anything from me. I don't like to talk about my personal life on my channel because I know that no one really gives a shit at the end of the day, nor do I think it's really anyone else's business outside of my actual friends and family. Mental health sucks, we all deal with lows, but all that matters now is that I'm willing and able to get back on the horse and try to make up for that lost time. I'm really, truly sorry to everyone who supports me that I haven't been able to deliver on a constant stream of uploads. There's no excusing that, so I'm gonna try to make it up to you guys. Reload's take on the answer just came out, so expect a video on that in a relatively swift fashion. I've also gotten started on the production of a Sonic Adventure 2 video, and have also been preparing for Metaphor to cap off the year. Maybe there'll be 1 or 2 extra videos in there, but I don't want to make any promises at this point. As always, if you want to stay up to date with that and other upcoming videos, maybe consider following me on Twitter or joining my Discord server. Both will be linked in the description. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.